I used to believe that by 61, a woman earned a certain kind of safety, not the soft kind that comes from luck, but the solid kind you build yourself piece by piece over decades, the kind that comes from paying your bills on time, keeping your word, and learning when to say no. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for most of my adult life, I made a living making sure numbers told the truth. Healthcare finance is not glamorous, but it is honest work. You learn quickly that if the math does not add up, someone pays for it later. A hospital closes a wing, a family loses coverage. A decision made in comfort shows up as a crisis down the line. That mindset followed me everywhere. I lived alone by choice in Naples, Florida, in a modest waterfront condo I bought after my divorce years ago. I liked waking up early, opening the sliding doors, and letting the Gulf air move through the rooms before the heat settled in. I liked knowing every sound the building made at night. I liked that my life ran quietly, predictably. Friends teased me for being cautious. I called it being prepared. By the time I met Richard Hale, I had already buried both of my parents, helped raise my nieces, and survived a marriage that ended without fireworks, but with a long, aching exhaustion. I was not looking for rescue. I was not lonely in the dramatic sense. I had a career I respected, a circle of friends who showed up when it mattered, and a bank account that let me sleep at night. If anything, I was protective of my peace. Richard came into my life gently, the way things sometimes do when you are no longer chasing them. We met at a charity dinner for a regional medical foundation, the kind of event where everyone pretends not to check their phones under the table. He sat next to me by chance, or so it seemed. He was tall, well-groomed, with silver beginning to take over his hair in a way that suggested confidence rather than neglect. He asked what I did. When I told him, he did not make a joke about numbers or complain about insurance. He listened. That alone set him apart. He told me about his work in commercial real estate, about growing up in Sarasota in a family that measured success in properties and memberships. He spoke calmly, without bragging, which I appreciated. There was an ease about him, a sense that he had been comfortable for a long time. When the dinner ended, he asked if I would like to get coffee sometime. Not dinner, not drinks, coffee. It felt appropriate, safe. Our relationship unfolded slowly. He respected my schedule, I respected his routines. We spent weekends walking the pier, cooking simple meals, talking about everything except the future. That was intentional on my part. I had learned that people reveal more when you do not push them. Over time, I saw consistency in him. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered details. He did not flinch at my independence. When he eventually asked me to marry him, it did not feel like a leap. It felt like a step. At 63, Richard had been married once before, no children. His marriage had ended amicably, according to him, and I had no reason to doubt that. His family, however, was another matter. The Hales were old Florida in the way that meant everything and nothing at the same time. They belonged everywhere that required a recommendation. They moved through private clubs like they were extensions of their living rooms. When Richard introduced me, it was with pride, but also with a subtle tension I could not quite name. Margaret Hale, his mother, was gracious in a way that never relaxed. She asked questions that sounded like interest but felt like inventory. Where did I grow up? What did my parents do? How long had I been in my field? She smiled the whole time. Thomas Hale, his father, was quieter, more direct. He wanted to know about my financial planning, my retirement strategy, whether I had ever worked with trusts. I answered honestly, without apology. It was clear they were assessing me, not unkindly, but thoroughly. I noticed small things. Margaret reminding Richard not to overshare. Thomas steering conversations back to logistics. Their preference for discussing the wedding as a project rather than a celebration. None of it rose to the level of alarm. At our age, pragmatism is often mistaken for coldness. I told myself this was just how families with resources operated. Efficient, controlled. The proposal itself was private. Just the two of us on my balcony as the sun dropped into the water. Richard knelt awkwardly, laughed at himself, and held out a ring that was tasteful, understated, and far more expensive than I would have chosen on my own. He told me he admired my steadiness, that I made him feel grounded. I said yes without hesitation. It felt earned. In the weeks that followed, planning began in earnest. The venue was a private yacht club in Sarasota that the Hales had belonged to for decades. Margaret took charge immediately, presenting timelines and guest lists as if this were a corporate merger. I pushed back gently where I needed to. I did not want extravagance. I wanted something contained, respectful. We compromised. Or rather, I thought we did. What I did not recognize at the time was how much I was relying on my past experience to protect me from present risk. I had spent years believing that if I stayed observant, if I kept my emotions in check, if I trusted evidence over instinct, I would be fine. That belief had served me well in boardrooms and budget reviews. It had gotten me through a divorce without losing myself. It had become part of my identity. There is a particular confidence that comes with age, especially for women who have survived disappointment without bitterness. You stop expecting perfection, but you also stop tolerating chaos. I thought that was what I was bringing into this marriage: balance, perspective, a calm hand on the wheel. Looking back, I can see the early signs, though at the time they registered as nothing more than noise. A comment from Margaret about keeping certain matters private. Thomas asking about documents I had not yet seen. Richard deflecting questions about scheduling with an easy smile. All reasonable on their own. Together, they formed a pattern I was not ready to name. On the morning I finalized the last details with the caterer, I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, sunlight stretching across the floor. I felt settled, capable, proud of myself for choosing a life that felt measured rather than dramatic. I had no idea that within days, everything I thought I understood about control, about preparation, about listening, would be tested. At the time, I believed experience was armor. I believed caution was enough. I believed that when you reached a certain age, you were past the kind of mistakes that blindsided you. That belief would not survive what came next. That belief began to fray the first time I spent an entire weekend with the Hale family and realized how carefully everything around them was managed. Sarasota looked different through their lens. Private entrances, reserved parking, doors that opened before you reached them. Richard drove us to the yacht club on a Friday afternoon, his hand resting lightly on my knee as we passed the gate. The guard nodded without asking for identification. I remember thinking how much trust was built into that gesture, and how fragile trust could be when it was assumed instead of earned. The club itself was immaculate in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Polished wood, muted colors, the faint smell of citrus cream layered over salt air. Margaret was already there when we arrived, seated near the windows with a plan of looking. She rose the moment she saw us, arms open, smile in place. She complimented my dress, asked about my drive, commented on the weather. Everything sounded warm. Everything was delivered with precision. When she hugged me, it was brief, careful, as if she were checking posture rather than offering comfort. Thomas joined us a few minutes later, walking with the confidence of a man who had never needed to rush. He shook my hand firmly, then sat down and opened his menu without looking at it. Conversation flowed easily at first. Boats, upcoming events, a fundraiser the club was hosting in the spring. Then gradually, the questions shifted. Thomas asked about my retirement plans, not out of curiosity, but with the tone of someone confirming a checklist. I told him about my accounts, my long-term projections, the contingencies I had built in. He nodded, satisfied, then asked if I had ever worked with trusts directly. I said yes, professionally, but that my personal assets were straightforward. He made a note on a napkin, slid it into his pocket, and moved on. Margaret leaned in at one point and mentioned how important it was to keep family matters within the family, especially when so many people were unsure what response was expected. Richard seemed relaxed throughout, laughing at the right moments, reaching for my hand under the table. When I caught his gi, he gave me a small, reassuring smile. I told myself this was normal. Families were different. Wealth came with its own customs. I had navigated boardrooms full of people who spoke the same language. I could do this too. The rest of the weekend followed a similar rhythm. Brunches that lasted hours, dinners that felt more like meetings, conversations that circled around appearances without ever touching substance. I noticed how often Margaret redirected discussions when they drifted toward anything uncomfortable. I noticed how Thomas framed every decision in terms of risk and benefit, never emotion. On Sunday morning, as we sat on the terrace watching boats idle in the marina, Margaret brought up the wedding timeline. She suggested moving it up by a few weeks. Her reasoning was practical. Schedules, availability, the club calendar. I hesitated, explaining that I had commitments at work that would be difficult to rearrange on short notice. She listened, then smiled again. The same smile she always used. "Of course," she said, "but these things tend to get complicated if you wait too long." Richard squeezed my hand, silent. Later, in the car, I asked him about it. He brushed it off, saying his mother liked efficiency. I accepted that explanation, though a part of me wondered why efficiency always seemed to benefit their side of the equation. Back in Naples, life returned to its familiar pace. Meetings, reports, early mornings with coffee on the balcony. But something had shifted. I found myself replaying conversations, noticing patterns I had previously dismissed. The way Margaret spoke about the wedding as if it were already theirs. The way Thomas referenced arrangements I had not agreed to. The way Richard avoided specifics when I asked about next steps. One evening, as we were reviewing vendor contracts at my dining table, I asked Richard directly whether his parents had expectations about how our finances would be structured after the marriage. He looked up from his papers, surprised. "They just want to make sure everything is clean," he said. "You know how they are." I pressed gently, asking what clean meant. He hesitated, then said we would go over it later. After the wedding details were settled, I did not argue. At the time, it seemed reasonable. We had plenty of time, I thought. The more I interacted with the Hale family, the more I felt a subtle pressure to conform, not overt but persistent. Invitations framed as obligations, suggestions that felt like directives, compliments that carried conditions. It was not hostility, it was expectation. I spoke to my sister Linda about it one afternoon over the phone. She listened quietly, then asked a question that caught me off guard. She asked whether I felt like a partner or a guest. I laughed it off, but the question lingered long after we hung up. I began to notice how often the word us was used without my consent. Our venue, our plans, our timeline. Decisions were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. When I gently corrected someone, the room would go quiet for a moment, then resume as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, Margaret stopped by unannounced while Richard was out. She brought pastries and sat at my kitchen counter, commenting on the view. She told me how happy she was that Richard had found someone stable, someone appropriate. She said it kindly, but the word landed heavily. She asked if I had spoken to a lawyer about the paperwork. When I said not yet, she suggested a firm the family had used for years. She framed it as a convenience, a way to avoid unnecessary complications. I thanked her and said I would consider it. After she left, I stood at the sink longer than necessary. Staring out at the water, I felt unsettled in a way I could not quite articulate. Nothing she had said was wrong. Nothing was overtly inappropriate. And yet, I felt as if I had been reminded, subtly but firmly, of where I stood. That night, Richard noticed my quiet. I told him I was tired. It was easier than explaining the creeping sense of being managed. He kissed my forehead and told me everything would fall into place once the wedding was behind us. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that this was just pre-wedding stress magnified by age and caution. I told myself that I had chosen him for good reasons, that his family did not define him, that I was overthinking. Still, as I lay awake later, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, I could not shake the feeling that I was being rushed towards something I had not fully examined. Experience had taught me that when people insist on speed, it is rarely for your benefit. I did not yet know what I was being steered away from seeing. I only knew that the pressure was building, quietly, insistently, like a tide you do not notice until it reaches your knees. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It took shape through people, and the first person who made me notice it was Daniel Brooks. I met him properly a few weeks later at a small dinner Richard hosted for his closest friends. It was held at a quiet restaurant near the bay, nothing flashy, the kind of place that cared more about lighting than reputation. Daniel arrived last, apologized without drama, and took the seat farthest from the center of the table. He was 60, a structural engineer who ran his own firm, someone Richard described as steady and reliable, the best man. though you would never have guessed it from how little attention he drew to himself. Daniel spoke when spoken to and listened the rest of the time. While others reminisced loudly about old projects and vacations, he watched, not in a suspicious way, more like someone accustomed to noticing what others missed. When the waiter asked about drinks, Daniel ordered water. When the conversation turned to business, he asked one precise question and let the answer sit. I noticed him because he noticed everything else. At one point, Richard mentioned a workshop he planned to attend in Sarasota, something related to music, an interest he had recently picked up. Daniel nodded, asked where it was being held, then asked what days. Richard answered easily, but I saw Daniel glance at his phone afterward, not in a rude way, just briefly, as if checking a detail. Later, when the group broke into smaller conversations, Daniel found himself standing beside me near the window. We watched boats drift by in the dark, their lights blurring on the water. He asked how I liked Sarasota. I told him I preferred Naples, that Sarasota felt busier. He smiled and said he understood. There was a pause, comfortable but deliberate. Then he asked whether I had enjoyed working in healthcare finance all these years. I said I had, that I liked systems, that I liked knowing decisions had weight. He nodded again, then asked whether I had ever regretted not slowing down earlier in life. It was an odd question, but not intrusive. I told him no, that slowing down had never felt like an option. He accepted that answer without comment. Before we returned to the table, he asked one more thing. He asked whether Richard and I had already sorted out the paperwork. He did not specify what paperwork. He did not need to. I told him we were planning to look at everything after the wedding details were finalized. He studied my face for a moment, then said he understood. Nothing about the exchange was alarming. And yet, as I drove home later, his question replayed in my mind. It was not the content. It was the timing. Daniel was not a man who asked questions without reason. Over the next few weeks, I saw him more often. He joined us for brunch at the yacht club, attended a planning meeting at the venue, stopped by briefly during a rehearsal walkthrough. Each time, he remained on the edges, contributing just enough to be present without taking up space. Each time, I noticed him watching Richard. It was subtle. A look when Richard checked his phone, a pause when Richard mentioned staying late somewhere, a slight tightening of Daniel's jaw when a detail did not line up. No accusations, no confrontation, just observation. One afternoon, while Richard he leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets, and asked how I was feeling about everything. I gave the polite answer, excited, a little overwhelmed, ready to be done with planning. He listened, then asked whether I felt rushed. I hesitated before answering. I said no, not exactly. He nodded, as if that told him something. He told me he had known Richard since college. They had built things together, projects and friendships, and he respected him. He said this plainly, without embellishment. Then he added that he believed in addressing problems before they became structural. The word landed harder than he intended. He explained that in his work, ignoring a small misalignment could compromise an entire structure. That good intentions did not correct poor planning, that timing mattered. He said it without drawing a direct line to my situation, but the implication was clear. I asked him what he meant. He shrugged and said that sometimes people confuse movement with progress. He said that once a contract was signed, leverage changed. He did not say whose leverage. He did not need to. When Richard returned, Daniel excused himself, leaving me with the echo of his words and a feeling I could not shake. That night, I brought it up with Richard carefully. I mentioned Daniel's comment about timing, framed it as concern rather than suspicion. Richard laughed it off, saying Daniel had always been cautious, sometimes to a fault. He told me not to read too much into it, that everything was under control. Under control? The phrase echoed something I had believed about my own life. As the weeks passed, I noticed how often Daniel was present when important conversations happened, and how rarely he spoke during them. When Margaret discussed seating arrangements and guest lists, Daniel listened. When Thomas talked about trusts and family assets, Daniel listened. When Richard reassured everyone that details would be handled, Daniel listened. Once, during a walk through the venue, I caught Daniel's eye across the room. He held my gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod, not agreement, recognition. I started paying closer attention to my own instincts. I noticed that Richard had begun to deflect questions with charm rather than answers. I noticed that decisions were being made in clusters, quickly, with little room for revision. I noticed that the word later was used often. One evening, Daniel called me unexpectedly. He apologized for the intrusion, said he would understand if I did not want to talk. I told him it was fine. He asked whether I had set a date to review documents yet. I told him no. He paused, then said he wanted to be clear. He said he was not trying to interfere. He said he respected me. He said that if he were in my position, he would want to know what he was stepping into before committing. He said that waiting rarely improved clarity. I thanked him for his concern and ended the call. I did not confront him again. Instead, I watched. I observed how Daniel interacted with the Hale family, how they treated him with a mix of familiarity and dismissal. He was useful, but not central, trusted, but not indulged. I began to understand his position. He was close enough to see the cracks, far enough to avoid being blamed for pointing them out. The night before the next planning meeting, I lay awake thinking about leverage, about timing, about the cost of ignoring small misalignments. I thought about how often women my age were told to be flexible, to accommodate, to avoid rocking the boat. I wondered whether that advice had ever truly served anyone. By the time I fell asleep, I knew one thing. Daniel was not trying to alarm me. He was trying to warn me. I just had not decided yet whether I was ready to listen. I told myself that listening did not require reacting, that awareness alone was enough to keep me steady while everything else continued forward. Richard's new interest in music became the most convenient explanation for his changing schedule. It started innocently, or at least it looked that way on the surface. A flyer on the kitchen counter for a weekend workshop in Sarasota, a comment about wanting something creative after years of spreadsheets and negotiations. I smiled and told him I thought it was healthy to try new things. I meant it. At our age, curiosity felt like a virtue, not a threat. The workshops multiplied. One weekend turned into two. Then midweek evenings appeared on his calendar, labeled vaguely as practice or meeting. When I asked what kind of music he was working on, he spoke in broad strokes: vocal technique, performance confidence, finding his voice. He seemed energized in a way I had not seen before, flushed and animated when he came home late, carrying a leather folder I had never looked inside. I noticed how quickly he deflected details. If I asked who else was attending, he said a small group. If I asked where it was held, he said a private space near the bay. Each answer was true enough to discourage follow-up, but incomplete enough to leave room for assumption. I filled in the gaps myself. That was easier than pressing. Lydia Hale entered the picture gradually. At first she was a name mentioned in passing. A local singer, a coach, someone with connections. Richard spoke about her with admiration that sounded professional. He said she was disciplined, demanding, serious about craft. I nodded and listened, thinking of how many times I had spoken that way about mentors in my own field. The first time I met her was at a casual gathering after one of the workshops. She was attractive in a way that drew attention without effort. Dark hair pulled back loosely, posture relaxed, eyes sharp. She greeted me warmly, complimented my necklace, asked what I did for work. When I told her, she reacted with genuine interest, asking questions about budgets and systems rather than patience. I appreciated that. What I did not appreciate, though I could not have articulated it at the time, was how comfortable she was with Richard. Not flirtatious, not overt, just familiar, the kind of ease that comes from shared time in private spaces. When she touched his arm to emphasize a point, it lingered a moment longer than necessary. When she laughed, she looked at him first. I noticed. I said nothing. Over the next few weeks, Richard's absences became more frequent. He would leave early on Saturdays, saying he needed to rehearse. He returned late on Tuesdays, tired but satisfied. I adjusted my schedule to accommodate, working longer hours during the week so we could spend time together on Sundays. When I suggested joining him one evening, he hesitated, then said it might be distracting. I told myself that was reasonable. I found myself justifying his behavior internally, rehearsing explanations that made me feel generous rather than suspicious. midlife reinvention, creative energy, a desire to be seen differently after decades in the same role. None of these were lies. They were simply incomplete truths. Daniel remained in the background, his presence steady and unobtrusive. When he asked how things were going, I gave the same polished answer I gave everyone else. Fine, busy, almost there. He listened, then changed the subject. I wondered whether he heard what I was not saying. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed pleased with Richard's new passion. She spoke about it as if it were an asset, something that made him more interesting, more alive. She suggested incorporating music into the wedding reception, perhaps a short performance. I smiled tightly and said we would think about it. One evening, after Richard returned from Sarasota later than expected, I asked him how the session had gone. He launched into a description of technique and progress, using language that sounded rehearsed. When I asked whether Lydia thought he was improving, he smiled broadly and said she did. He said she believed he had potential. The word potential hung between us, heavy with implication. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the same sensation I had learned to pay attention to in meetings when something did not align. Instead of addressing it, I stood up and began clearing the table. I told myself I was tired. I told myself I was being unfair. That night, I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan turn, counting rotations the way I had once counted breaths during stressful negotiations. My mind replayed moments I had dismissed earlier: Lydia's familiarity, Richard's evasiveness, Daniel's careful questions, Margaret's insistence on speed. None of it proved anything. All of it suggested something. The next morning, I reviewed my calendar and noticed how many of Richard's commitments were clustered away from Naples. Sarasota had become a frequent destination. I considered asking to attend one of the workshops, then decided against it. I did not want to appear insecure. I did not want to be the woman who checked up on her partner. Instead, I did what I had always done. I gathered information quietly. I asked general questions of mutual acquaintances. I paid attention to tone rather than content. I noticed that Lydia was always mentioned in the singular, never as part of a group. I noticed that Richard had stopped talking about other participants entirely. One afternoon, while organizing paperwork for the wedding, I came across a receipt for a venue rental in Sarasota, paid for by Richard, dated on a night he had told me he was staying late at the club. The amount was modest, but the detail mattered. I stared at the paper longer than necessary, then placed it back in the folder. I told myself there was a logical explanation. A performance space, a private rehearsal. I told myself that I trusted him. Trust, after all, was supposed to be the foundation of what we were building. Still, Taco, the feeling did not go away. It deepened, settling into a quiet awareness that something was shifting beyond my control. I began to feel like a guest in my own relationship, informed of plans rather than included in them. Daniel called one evening, his voice calm, asking whether I had a moment. I told him I did. He asked how preparations were going. I answered honestly this time, saying they felt rushed. He acknowledged that, then asked whether I felt comfortable with everything as it stood. I hesitated, then said I was still thinking. He did not push. He said that thinking was good, that clarity often arrived when you gave it space. Before ending the call, he said one thing that stayed with me. He said that in his experience, people who had nothing to hide did not mind being seen. I thanked him and hung up, my heart pounding harder than I expected. That weekend, Richard left early again, carrying his leather folder and humming softly to himself. I watched him from the doorway, noting the ease with which he moved, the lightness in his step. I wondered when that lightness had begun, and what it was feeding on. As the door closed behind him, I stood alone in the quiet apartment, surrounded by wedding binders and neatly stacked envelopes. I felt the weight of choice pressing in from all sides. Continue forward and trust that my instincts were overreacting, or pause and risk disrupting everything we had planned. By the time Richard returned that evening, I had already decided to wait. Not because I was convinced everything was fine, but because I was not yet ready to accept what my unease was trying to tell me. That choice would cost me more than I understood. But at the time, it felt like restraint. Restraint has a way of disguising itself as wisdom, especially when you have spent a lifetime being praised for keeping your composure. The week before the wedding moved faster than I expected. Final fittings, vendor confirmations, last-minute guest changes. my calendar filled with obligations that left little room to sit with my thoughts. I told myself that momentum was a kind of proof, that if something were truly wrong, it would force itself into the open. That belief felt comforting, even responsible. Richard was rarely home. When he was, his mind seemed elsewhere, humming melodies under his breath, fingers tapping rhythms against the counter. He talked about Lydia often now, always in professional terms, always with a glow that suggested admiration rather than intimacy. I listened, nodded, offered encouragement when it seemed expected. I did not ask questions that might reveal answers I was not prepared to handle. Daniel remained the quiet constant in the background. He attended the rehearsal walkthrough, standing near the exit while Margaret directed staff with practiced authority. When our eyes met across the room, he gave a small nod, not encouragement, not warning, just acknowledgement. I felt seen in a way that unsettled me. 2 days before the wedding, Richard suggested we spend the afternoon at the yacht club to finalize seating arrangements. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that presses against your skin and makes everything feel closer than it is. We sat at a small table overlooking the marina, folders spread between us. Margaret joined us shortly after, carrying her planner like an extension of her arm. She moved quickly, flipping pages, making notes, assigning tasks. When I hesitated over a seating change, she smiled and said it would be simpler to keep families grouped. Simpler for whom was left unsaid. I agreed, feeling the familiar pressure to move along. Richard excused himself to take a call, stepping a few feet away with his phone pressed to his ear. I watched him from the corner of my eye, noticing how his posture shifted, how his voice softened. Margaret followed my gaze and placed her hand over mine briefly, a gesture meant to reassure. She said that stress made people distracted, that Richard had a lot on his mind. She said that after the wedding, things would settle. She said that sometimes you had to push through discomfort to reach stability. The words were reasonable. The timing was not. After she left, Daniel approached, holding 2 glasses of water. He offered me one, then leaned against the railing beside me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The boats bobbed gently in the distance, ropes creaking softly against the dock. He asked how I was holding up, not how planning was going, not whether I was excited, how I was holding up. I told him I was fine, that it was all a bit much but manageable. He did not challenge that. He waited. Then he said that he wanted to be careful with what he said, that he did not want to overstep. He said he respected both of us. And that respect was the reason he was speaking now rather than later. He said that timing mattered. I felt my chest tighten. I asked him what he meant. He took a breath, then said that he had seen patterns over the years, in work and in life, and that some patterns did not correct themselves once certain thresholds were crossed. He said that commitments created momentum that was hard to reverse. I asked him whether he was talking about Richard. He said he was talking about decisions. He said that once paperwork was signed and expectations were set, clarity became more expensive. He did not accuse. He did not name names. He said that if he were in my position, he would want to know everything before making something permanent. He said that stopping was sometimes easier than undoing. I remember looking out at the water, the sun reflecting sharply off the surface, making it hard to focus. I asked him whether he knew something I did not. He said he knew enough to be concerned, and not enough to make claims. He said that concerned was a state worth paying attention to. He added one final thought before excusing himself. He said that silence often benefited the people who asked for it. I stood there long after he left, the glass of water warming in my hand. His words echoed the unease that had been building quietly inside me for weeks. And yet, when Richard returned, smiling and apologetic about the call, I said nothing. That evening, Richard suggested dinner out. Wanting a break from planning, we went to a familiar place near the beach, one we had visited many times before. The hostess greeted us warmly, led us to our usual table. The routine felt comforting, almost nostalgic. Over dinner, Richard talked about the ceremony, about how proud his parents were, about how much this meant to them. He spoke about the future in broad terms, plans that sounded pleasant but vague. I listened, searching his face for something I could not define. I considered telling him about my conversation with Daniel. I considered asking direct questions. Instead, I asked how he was feeling. He said he was excited, nervous in a good way, He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. In that moment, I chose familiarity over clarity. I told myself that Daniel was being overly cautious, that his perspective was colored by his profession. I told myself that Richard deserved trust, that doubt without proof was unfair. That night, I lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word. I thought about how often women were told to keep the peace, to avoid rocking the boat, especially later in life when stability was prized. I wondered how many times restraint had been mistaken for strength. The next morning, I received a message from Daniel. He apologized if he had caused stress, said that was not his intention. He said he would respect whatever I decided. He said he wanted me to know that his door was open if I had questions later. I did not respond right away. I went for a walk along the water, letting the salt air clear my head. I told myself that I was capable, that I had navigated far more complex situations than this. I told myself that intuition was not evidence. By the time I returned home, Richard was gone again, his folder missing from the counter. I stood in the quiet kitchen, sunlight slanting across the floor, and felt the weight of the choice I was making settle into my bones. I was being offered information without proof, caution without accusation. I could stop everything now, demand answers, disrupt plans that involved dozens of people, or I could continue forward, trusting that my years of experience had taught me how to handle whatever came next. I chose to continue, not because I was convinced everything was fine, but because I believed I could manage the consequences if it was not. That belief felt rational at the time, even empowering. I did not yet understand how costly that assumption would be. That assumption carried me straight into the night everything finally broke. The evening before the wedding arrived, wrapped in ceremony. The Hale family insisted on a private dinner at the yacht club, something they framed as intimate and meaningful. By their definition, intimate meant fewer than 100 people and a string quartet playing softly near the windows. The air inside was cool and fragrant, polished wood and expensive flowers masking the salt drifting in from the marina. I arrived early with Richard, dressed carefully in a navy dress Margaret had approved, with a nod that felt more like a verdict. Staff moved efficiently around us, placing name cards, adjusting lighting, offering smiles that suggested they had been trained not to notice tension. My parents were not there. This was strictly a Hale affair, which Margaret had explained gently, as if sparing my family an inconvenience. Richard looked restless. He checked his phone more often than usual, excusing himself twice before dinner was even served. Each time, he returned with the same easy smile, the same apology about last-minute details. I accepted them, though the familiar tightness in my chest returned, sharper now. Daniel arrived quietly and took a seat near the end of the table. He met my eyes briefly and gave a small nod. No words, no warning, just presence. I found myself oddly grateful for it. Margaret stood to make a short speech once everyone was seated. She spoke about family, about continuity, about how proud she was to welcome me. The room responded with polite applause. Richard squeezed my hand. I smiled, feeling like an observer in my own life. As dinner progressed, Richard disappeared again, this time longer than before. Conversations continued around me, flowing effortlessly from one topic to the next. I answered questions automatically, my attention drifting toward the hallway that led to the private suites upstairs. Margaret noticed. She leaned toward me and placed her hand lightly on my arm. She said that nerves made people wander, that Richard had always needed space before big moments. She said tonight was not the night to chase concerns. She said everything important would be handled tomorrow. Her voice was calm. The message was not. When Richard did not return after dessert, I stood. Margaret rose immediately, her smile tight. She asked where I was going. I said I needed some air. She suggested I sit back down, that someone would find Richard shortly. For the first time, I felt something harden inside me. I said I would be fine. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, reminding me that guests were watching, that tonight was about appearances, that whatever was bothering me could wait. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and understood something I had been avoiding. This was not about my comfort. It was about control. I told her I needed to check on my fiancé and stepped past her before she could respond. The staircase to the private level was quiet, carpet muffling my steps. The air felt different up there, heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I walked slowly, listening. I heard voices at the far end of the hall, then laughter cut short, then silence. I stopped outside one of the suites. The door was closed. I recognized Richard's voice inside, low and intimate in a way I had not heard in weeks. My hand hovered near the handle. I did not knock. When I opened the door, the room seemed to freeze. Richard was there, close to Lydia, her hand still resting against his chest. They both turned toward me, surprise flashing across their faces before settling into something else. Guilt, calculation, relief that the moment had arrived. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I noticed details I would later wish I could forget. The disarray of the room, the familiarity of their posture, the way Lydia straightened, smoothing her dress without meeting my eyes. Richard said my name. He took a step toward me, hands raised slightly as if approaching a startled animal. He said this was not what it looked like. The words sounded automatic, rehearsed. I asked him how long. My voice did not shake. It surprised me how steady it was. He hesitated, then said it had not meant anything. He said it was just physical. He said he had been confused. He said a lot of things that did not answer my question. Lydia finally spoke, her voice tight. She said it was complicated. She said she had not planned for this. She said she cared about Richard. She did not mention me at all. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Daniel appeared in the doorway behind me, his face grim but composed. A moment later, Margaret and Thomas arrived, followed by a few others drawn by the raised voices. Eyes darting between the three of us. Richard tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other now. He said he loved me. He said this did not change anything. He said we could fix it. He said it would be easier if we talked privately. I listened, then spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I said there would be no wedding. I said this ended tonight. The room went still. Margaret stepped forward, her composure cracking for the first time. She said we should not make decisions in the heat of the moment. She said people could talk. She said this could be handled quietly. I looked at her and felt a strange calm settle over me. I said this was already public. I said I was done. I turned and walked out before anyone could stop me. I did not wait for permission. I did not look back. The sounds of the party continued below, muffled now, distant and unreal. I descended the stairs slowly, aware of my breathing, of the way my hands trembled only after the decision had been made. Outside, the night air hit my face, cool and sharp. The marina lights shimmered on the water. I stood there for a moment, grounding myself in the familiar rhythm of waves against the dock. Behind me, voices rose, urgent and angry, but they felt far away. Whatever was coming next would come without my participation. I walked to my car, each step deliberate, knowing that the life I had been preparing to enter no longer existed. As I closed the door and started the engine, one thought repeated itself with quiet clarity. I had been warned. That realization settled in slowly as I drove home, the road ahead empty and dark, my hands steady on the wheel in a way that surprised me. I did not cry that night. I noticed that first. I felt hollow, stunned, but not undone. Years of managing crises had taught me how to compartmentalize, how to move from one task to the next without collapsing. I parked in my garage, locked the door behind me, and stood in the quiet of my condo, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of water against the seawall. Everything looked exactly the same. My life, at least on the surface, had not yet caught up to what had happened. My phone began to light up before I had even taken off my shoes. Missed calls from Richard, messages from numbers I recognized and some I did not. I set the phone face down on the counter and poured myself a glass of water. My hands shook slightly then, just enough to notice. I went to bed fully dressed and slept for a few hours, the kind of shallow sleep that feels more like waiting. When I woke, the sun was already up, light spilling across the floor. For a moment, disorientation washed over me, then everything returned at once, sharp and undeniable. I checked my phone, dozens of messages, Richard asking to talk, insisting this was a misunderstanding, promising explanations. Margaret asking for discretion, for calm, for time. Thomas suggesting a meeting, as if this were a business matter that could be negotiated. I did not respond. Instead, I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. I told him I had left the club and that there would be no wedding. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. He did not say I told you so. That mattered more than he knew. He asked whether I was safe. I told him I was. He said he would handle anything that needed handling on his end. I thanked him and ended the call, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. Someone else understood the weight of what had happened without trying to minimize it. By mid-morning, the story had already begun to spread. The Hale family had deep roots, and deep roots carried information quickly. Friends reached out cautiously, their messages carefully worded, asking if I was all right, if there was anything they could do. I replied politely, briefly, letting them know I needed time. Richard showed up at my door that afternoon. I watched him through the peephole for a long moment before opening it. He looked exhausted, his confidence stripped away, eyes rimmed red, hair uncombed. When I opened the door, he started speaking immediately, words tumbling out, explanations layered on top of apologies. He said it had meant nothing. He said he had panicked. He said he loved me. He said we could still fix this if we kept it quiet. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him there was nothing to fix. I told him I was done. I told him to leave. He tried to step inside. I blocked the doorway. My voice remained calm. I told him that if he did not leave, I would call the police. He stared at me then, truly seeing me for the first time in weeks. He left without another word. That was the last time I saw him inside my home. The following days unfolded with a strange efficiency. I canceled vendors. I returned gifts that had already arrived. I called my parents and explained what had happened in simple terms, sparing them the details they did not need. My mother cried. My father was quiet, then said he was proud of me. I held on to that. Margaret called repeatedly. When I finally answered, she spoke in a controlled rush, suggesting ways to manage the fallout. She said people would forget. She said mistakes happened. She said Lydia was being dealt with. She said Richard was devastated. I told her that my decision was final. I told her that I would not be participating in any effort to smooth this over. I told her that my priority was my own well-being. She was silent for a moment, then said she had hoped I would be more understanding. I ended the call. Daniel checked in again that evening, asking if I needed anything. I told him I did not. He said he was there if that changed. He did not ask questions. He did not offer advice. He simply stayed present. As the shock wore off, the insistence on appearances, the deflections and half answers, the warning I had chosen to set aside. None of it felt accidental anymore. I met with my lawyer 2 days later, a woman named Susan Miller, recommended by a colleague who had no connection to the Hale family. She reviewed the documents I had been given and explained, carefully, what I had nearly agreed to: trust structures that would have limited my autonomy, clauses that assumed my compliance, financial entanglements that would have been difficult to unwind. I left her office shaken and grateful. The consequences of my restraint could have been far worse. Meanwhile, the community reacted in its own way. Invitations dried up. Whispers replaced greetings. I heard through others that Richard had been removed from a project he had been negotiating, that Lydia had lost a performance slot at the club. I did not seek out these updates. They found me anyway. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative shifted. Richard attempted to paint himself as misunderstood, as a man who had made a mistake under pressure. Lydia disappeared entirely, her silence speaking louder than any statement. The Hale family closed ranks, retreating behind discretion and influence. I remained on the outside, watching from a distance. There were moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, alone with my thoughts, I wondered whether I should have confronted things earlier, whether I could have changed the outcome. Then I remembered Daniel on the dock, choosing his words carefully, offering me information without force. I remembered how I had weighed caution against disruption and chosen momentum. I understood then that this was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of timing. Weeks passed. Life resumed a new rhythm. I returned to work, grateful for the structure. Colleagues treated me with quiet respect, not asking questions, not offering platitudes. My world felt smaller, but steadier. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. He said he hoped I was doing well. He said that sometimes the most important warnings came softly, and that it was human to hesitate before listening. I thanked him for his honesty, even when it had been uncomfortable. He replied that honesty was easier than silence, if you were willing to accept the consequences. As the sky darkened and the lights along the water flickered on, I realized something else. Walking away had not been an act of strength. It had been an act of self-respect. And for the first time since the night at the yacht club, I felt the tension in my chest ease, just enough to breathe. That ease did not last long, because reality has a way of demanding paperwork. Within days of calling off the wedding, the practical consequences began to surface. Not the emotional ones. Those came and went in waves, but the administrative kind that arrived with emails and envelopes and polite requests for clarification. I had spent my career navigating systems, and this was a system I had nearly stepped into without fully seeing its shape. Margaret reached out again, this time with a tone that was less maternal and more strategic. She suggested we meet to discuss next steps, said it would be wise to protect everyone involved. She framed it as damage control, as if what had happened were a public relations issue rather than a breach of trust. I declined the meeting. I told her I needed space and legal advice. The silence that followed told me more than any argument could have. I scheduled an appointment with Susan Miller the following morning. Her office was in a low building near downtown Naples, unassuming and efficient. No marble floors, no art meant to impress. Susan herself was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, calm, and refreshingly direct. She listened as I explained the situation, taking notes without interruption. When I finished, she asked to see every document that had been shared with me so far. Prenuptial drafts, trust summaries, venue contracts that included clauses about liability. She read quietly, occasionally circling a line or making a note in the margin. I watched her face, searching for reassurance or alarm. When she finally looked up, she did not soften her expression. She told me plainly that postponing the wedding had saved me from significant legal entanglement. She explained how the proposed trust structure would have limited my control over my own assets once married. She pointed out clauses that assumed joint decision-making in ways that favored existing family holdings. She said that none of it was illegal, but it was designed with a very specific outcome in mind. I asked her whether this was standard. She said it was common in families with generational wealth, but only fair when all parties entered with full transparency and independent counsel. She said I had been close to signing away leverage without realizing it. I felt a chill run through me, not fear, but recognition. This was the structure Daniel had been hinting at. The momentum, the cost of clarity once commitments were made. Susan advised me to formally withdraw from all pending agreements in writing. She drafted the letters herself, precise and unemotional. She recommended that all future communication go through counsel if the Hale family continued to press for resolution. I agreed without hesitation. When I left her office, the air felt heavier, but my steps felt surer. I had avoided a trap not through cleverness, but through timing. Daniel called that afternoon. He had heard that I met with a lawyer and wanted to check in. I told him what Susan had explained. He was quiet for a moment, then said that his concerns had been rooted in similar observations. He said he had seen how the family structured partnerships, how control was rarely shared evenly. He said he had not wanted to speculate, but he had worried. I thanked him again, this time without reservation. He said he was glad I had acted when I did. He said that walking away before signing anything was the cleanest outcome possible, given the circumstances. The Hale family did not take my withdrawal quietly. Thomas sent a formal letter expressing disappointment and concern about reputational damage. He suggested mediation, framed as a way to ensure fairness. Margaret followed with a more personal message, appealing to our history, to my understanding nature, to the idea that families made allowances for mistakes. She implied that generosity now would be remembered later. I forwarded everything to Susan and did not respond directly. Word traveled quickly through the circles the Hales inhabited. Some people reached out with sympathy. others with curiosity thinly disguised as concern. A few stopped calling altogether. I learned which relationships had been conditional and which were not. The clarity was uncomfortable, but useful. Richard attempted contact once more, this time through an email that read like a confession and a plea combined. He took responsibility in abstract terms, spoke about pressure and confusion, about losing sight of what mattered. He asked for a conversation, said he wanted closure. I did not reply. Lydia vanished from my life entirely. I heard fragments through others, that she had left town for a while, that opportunities had dried up. I did not follow the details. Her absence felt appropriate. What surprised me was how quickly the community recalibrated. The yacht club removed Richard from a committee he had served on for years. A development deal he had been negotiating stalled. Invitations to events slowed. None of this was announced. It simply happened. Influence, once questioned, becomes fragile. I did not take pleasure in this. I did not feel vindicated. I felt removed, like someone watching weather pass through a place she no longer lived. At home, I began reclaiming space. Small acts, but grounding ones. One evening, Susan called to confirm that all withdrawals had been acknowledged. She said there were no outstanding obligations. She said I was free to move forward without legal consequence. I thanked her and hung up, sitting quietly for a long moment afterward. Freedom is a strange thing. It does not always feel triumphant. Sometimes it feels like emptiness where expectation used to be. Daniel and I met for coffee a week later. We talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, books we had read. At one point, he said he was sorry that his warning had come so late in the process. I told him it had come when I was able to hear it. That was the truth. As days turned into weeks, the sharp edges of the situation softened, not because it mattered less, but because I was no longer fighting it. I had chosen my position, and the consequences were unfolding without my intervention. I understood then that what I had walked away from was not just a marriage, but a system that required silence to function. By stepping aside, I had disrupted it more effectively than any confrontation could have. The realization brought a quiet consequences were still playing out elsewhere beyond my reach, without my involvement. I did not need to watch them to know they were real. Knowing they were real was enough, because the next phase unfolded in ways that confirmed everything I had already accepted. The social consequences did not arrive with announcements or apologies. They arrived quietly, through absence. A dinner invitation that never came. A committee meeting where Richard's name no longer appeared on the agenda. A familiar face at the club who looked past him instead of greeting him. In communities like ours, exclusion is rarely spoken aloud. It is simply practiced until it becomes permanent. I learned most of this secondhand. Friends who still moved comfortably in those circles mentioned changes casually, as if discussing the weather. Someone else was chairing a project Richard had once led. A development deal had stalled because investors were suddenly cautious. Lydia's name stopped appearing on event calendars. No explanations were offered. None were needed. Richard tried to regain control of the narrative. I heard that he had spoken privately with several people, framing what happened as a mutual misunderstanding amplified by stress. He described himself as overwhelmed, pressured by expectations, confused about what he wanted. It was a version of the truth that centered his discomfort while erasing my experience entirely. I was not surprised. I had seen this pattern before, in business and in life. When consequences appear, the instinct is to rewrite the story so that they seem undeserved. It is easier than accountability. What surprised me was how little it affected me. I did not feel the urge to defend myself publicly. I did not correct rumors or offer my own version of events. Anyone who mattered already knew enough. Anyone who did not was not someone I needed to convince. Silence, this time, worked in my favor. One afternoon, a colleague invited me to lunch at a small cafe near the office. She hesitated before bringing up Richard, then asked gently whether I was all right. I told her I was. She nodded and said that she admired how I had handled everything. I thanked her, though handling was not the word I would have chosen. I had simply stepped aside and let the truth surface on its own. Daniel remained a steady presence. We spoke occasionally, brief check-ins that never crossed into something else. He mentioned that he had distanced himself from Richard, not out of anger, but out of clarity. He said trust, once broken, rarely repaired itself without effort, and he did not see effort being made. I understood. I had come to the same conclusion. The yacht club felt different when I returned for the first time since the cancellation. Not hostile, just altered. Staff were polite but reserved. Familiar faces offered cautious smiles. I walked through the space without lingering, aware that I no longer belonged to the story being told there. As I left, I felt a sense of finality that surprised me with its calm. Some chapters do not end with confrontation. They end with disengagement. At work, my focus sharpened. Projects that had been delayed moved forward. Decisions felt cleaner without the background noise of personal upheaval. I took comfort in competence, in systems that responded predictably when you input the right information. It reminded me why I had chosen this career in the first place. There were moments, usually late at night, when anger resurfaced. Not the explosive kind, but the slow burn of realizing how close I had come to entangling my life with people who saw me as an asset rather than a partner. Those moments passed more quickly than I expected. Anger requires energy, and I was learning where mine was best spent. I ran into Margaret once at a charity event weeks later. She approached me with her usual composure, offered a polite greeting, and said she hoped I was well. I told her I was. She paused, as if waiting for something else, then nodded and moved on. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement. The interaction said everything it needed to. Richard never attempted to contact me again directly. I heard that he had left town for a while, that he was reassessing his priorities. Perhaps he was. Perhaps he was simply avoiding the environment that no longer indulged him. Either way, it was no longer my concern. What stayed with me most was the quiet support that had come from unexpected places. My parents, steady and proud, a few close friends who never asked for details. Susan, who had guided me through the legal aftermath with professionalism and respect. Daniel, whose warning had been offered without agenda. I realized then that revenge had never been part of the story. Not mine, at least. There was no satisfaction in watching someone else lose status or opportunity. What I felt was balance, a sense that actions and outcomes had aligned without my interference. That alignment brought a peace I had not anticipated. As summer deepened, I settled into routines that belonged solely to me. Morning walks along the water, evenings spent reading or cooking simple meals, occasional dinners with friends who knew my history and did not define me by it. Life did not return to what it had been. It became something quieter, more intentional. One night, as I sat on my balcony, listening to the distant sound of boats moving through the channel, I thought about Daniel's words again, about warnings that arrive softly, about the cost of ignoring them. I did not blame myself for hesitating. I recognized that readiness matters as much as information. I had learned something essential. Walking away does not always require confrontation. Sometimes it requires patience, trust in your own judgment, and the willingness to let others reveal themselves fully. The water below reflected the lights along the shore, rippling gently. I watched until the reflections blurred and disappeared, leaving only darkness and movement. Whatever was still unfolding elsewhere would do so without me, and for the first time in a long while, that knowledge felt like freedom. Freedom stayed with me longer than I expected, and it taught me how to listen to my own life again. In the months that followed, nothing dramatic happened, and that turned out to be the most important part. There were no grand apologies, no last-minute confessions, no cinematic confrontations, just ordinary days stacking up quietly, each one reminding me that peace does not announce itself. It simply arrives when you stop arguing with reality. I kept my routines, morning coffee on the balcony, work that demanded my full attention and rewarded it, evenings that belonged to me alone. At first the silence felt strange, like an empty room after guests leave. Then it began to feel like space, generous and forgiving. I thought often about Daniel and the way he had chosen his words, how he had not pushed, not dramatized, not insisted. He had trusted me to make my own decision, even knowing I might not make it right away. That kind of respect stays with you. We spoke less as time went on, not because anything was wrong, but because his role in my story had been fulfilled. He had warned me when I needed it. The rest was mine to carry. Susan checked in once more to confirm that nothing further had surfaced. She congratulated me on handling everything cleanly. I told her that clean was not the word I would use, but I appreciated the outcome. We laughed, and I realized how good it felt to laugh without tension or worry. My parents visited in the fall. We cooked together, walked along the beach, talked about everything except the wedding that never happened. My mother squeezed my hand one evening and said she was glad I had listened to myself. My father nodded in agreement. There was no judgment in their voices, only relief. That mattered. I learned to stop replaying the past, not because it stopped hurting entirely, but because it stopped teaching me anything new. The lesson had already landed. Experience does not make you immune to mistakes. It gives you the tools to survive them with dignity. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer I had ignored for weeks, I found the engagement ring tucked inside a small box. I held it for a moment, feeling the weight of expectation it had once carried. Then I placed it back and closed the drawer. It no longer represented a promise broken. It represented one perverted. There is a narrative people like to apply to stories like this. The idea that walking away is revenge, that consequences are something you orchestrate. That was never true for me. I did not expose anyone. I did not retaliate. I simply stopped participating. The rest unfolded on its own. That distinction matters, especially for women my age. We are often told that strength looks loud, that resolution requires confrontation. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes resolution is a door you close without slamming. I also learned something uncomfortable about myself. I had believed that restraint was always a virtue, that patience was the same as wisdom. It is not. Patience without clarity is just delay. Listening sooner would not have spared me pain entirely, but it would have spared me time. Still, I do not regret who I was in those weeks leading up to the wedding. I was cautious because caution had served me well before. I was generous because generosity had been rewarded in other parts of my life. Those traits were not flaws. They simply needed balance. Life now feels smaller and more precise. My circle is tighter, my boundaries clearer. I trust my instincts more, not because they are perfect. Occasionally, someone will ask if I would do anything differently. The honest answer is yes. I would listen earlier, not to rumors or fear, but to the quiet voice that notices patterns before they become problems. That voice rarely shouts. It waits. As I write this, the sun is setting beyond the water, painting the sky in colors that fade as quickly as they appear. Another day ending without ceremony. Another day lived on my own terms. If there is one thing I hope you take from my story, it is this. You do not owe anyone your silence. You do not owe anyone your momentum, and you are allowed to stop, even when everyone else expects you to keep going. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever ignored a warning or wished you had listened sooner, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts, your experiences, or simply let me know you were here. And if you want to stay for more stories like this, told honestly and without noise, stay with the channel. Sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.